All right, so welcome to East Boston. It's a nice place, gorgeous, gorgeous view. And it's sort of an underappreciated neighborhood, I think, within the city of Boston. Most people have been to East Boston, right? Why have they been to East Boston?
Airport.
To go to the airport, right? But drive through, don't even drive through, basically, come out of the tunnel, go up the ramp and go straight there without seeing the neighborhood, or maybe might take a glimpse from, the overpass at what's below, see the sign for Santarpios Pizza where we'll go later, and imagine that it must be pretty good, which it is. Things that have really defined East Boston and make it what it's all about are, one, immigrants and the immigration experience and its association with immigration, and two, a sort of resistance to the neighborhood being used as an artery rather than a neighborhood. Where we are, right, East Boston is today a peninsula, but geographically, wasn't always a peninsula. It was a series of harbor islands that were filled, and the tidal flats in between filled to make a peninsula. And in the 1830s, the East Boston Development Company bought a large amount of land here to start to develop it because it was so close to the city and could be easily connected to it, which eventually comes with the subway in 1905, I want to say. And they start developing, laying out streets, building houses to sell. And in particular, immigration to the city is coming up, and people are looking for more space and more places to live. The city actually annexes East Boston to make it part of the city of Boston in 1837. And after that, large numbers of people move here, and it gets built up and developed quite quickly. And this is primarily a neighborhood for immigrants, right? So I said 1830s, do we know who starts coming into Boston in significant numbers in the 1830s and in a wave in the 1840s? Any guesses? You haven't been in Boston long enough. The Irish? Dimitri said the Irish. Hickory said the Irish. Right, the Irish. So this is initially primarily an Irish neighborhood, but about 50 years later, it becomes a predominantly Jewish and Italian neighborhood. So after the Irish, the next significant migration into East Boston is Eastern European Jews in the 1880s and 1890s. Italians come moving into the neighborhood in significant numbers right around then too. The period of sort of dense Jewish population in East Boston was shorter than that of Italian, of this being an Italian neighborhood. Jewish population starts to go down already by the 1920s, but Italians remain in this neighborhood right through the end of the 20th century, and there's still plenty of Italians in the neighborhood. But now it's majority Hispanic neighborhood with a large Arabic-speaking minority and actually many languages spoken around as you're walking. So like I said, there's also an association itself between the neighborhood and immigrants, right? It sees itself as an immigrant neighborhood and as a place that absorbs immigrants. And part of that has to do with the fact that there was the East Boston Immigration Absorption Center just up here, right in the corner of, it's been taken down. I think it's that stuff that's been taken down over there. It was the corner of Marginal and Jeffries. So this Immigration Absorption Center was opened between 1920 and 1954. It absorbed and processed about 23,000 immigrants. And that's not that significant a number, partially because they actually only processed about 10% of the overall city's immigrants coming in here. But also, does anybody know what was going on with immigration around that time? Any guesses? Well, it was a period of significant immigration restriction. So there was an act passed in 1924 substantially limiting immigration into the United States and apportioning quotas by place of origin. And this was only revised in 1952. So the time when this station was open was actually a period of significant immigration restriction. But as a place, it sort of fit with the neighborhood's understanding of itself as a place that absorbs immigrants. It also was used during World War II as a prison and detention camp for POWs that were caught at sea and brought back to the United States, as well as what were called non-resident enemy aliens. And those were non-citizens, different from the Japanese internment camps that you might have heard of. These were for people who were not citizens of Italy, Germany, and Japan, who were essentially held in prison for the war. So immigrants, that's a key element of how East Boston sees itself. Another, though, is something I talked about at the beginning, is a resistance to the neighborhoods being treated as if it was just a sort of transportation point to another place, right? So there was large-scale resistance to the construction of the 1A highway that goes right through the neighborhood. There was very recently major protests against the construction of a casino in East Boston. Suffolk Downs, the racetrack, is not far from here. And in a pretty impressive feat, I think it was 2013, there was a referendum on whether to allow this casino. And the owners of Suffolk Downs outspent the No Eastie Casino organization by about $2 million to $40,000, and No Eastie Casino still won. So they blocked the casino being in here. But of course, I'm leaving out, the most significant element of this story, which is the airport, right? And you could say to yourself, well, if you move to East Boston, right, you got to be willing to put up with the airport, right? Except for the fact that the airport itself, or even the conception of an airport, really only came into being in the 1920s, right? Many people were here before, and there are many people who are still here who had moved before then. But also airports themselves change over time, right? An airport in 1929 is very different from an airport in 1939, 1949, or 1959, right? And the introduction of large jets, especially in the 1960s, changed everything. Because at that point, other U.S. cities that had airports within their municipal boundaries start moving them for the most part. And there are of course exceptions in New York and DC, but many start moving them out to the suburbs. But here, no suburbs wanted the airport. They couldn't find a place to put it. And people preferred the airport simply swallowing East Boston. So you had a combination in the 60s of bigger jets, more jets, enormous amount of air pollution, noise pollution, the traffic to and from the airport, really making life very difficult for East Boston residents. And you had the formation of really significant neighborhood opposition, protesting the encroachment. The sort of most controversial moment came with the destruction of Woods Island Park, which was a Frederick Law Olmsted Park in East Boston that was swallowed for the expansion of the airport. And there were massive protests. People were very upset about it. And what was built in, I never got the chance to go to Woods Island Park, so it was supposed to be beautiful, so I don't know how nice it was. But the sort of compensation was built over there. You can see the two towers there. It's called Pierce Park. They built a new park, I suppose, compensation for the loss of Woods Island Park, which was further south that way. You can't actually see from here. We're in a very peaceable part. You can't actually see the planes landing and taking off, but we will get to a part where you will. You can see the major airport hotels over there. So that's your intro to East Boston as a community and as a neighborhood. And we have a couple other spots that I want to hit up before heading over to Deer Island. The first of which is Maverick Square, which gives the name to much of the neighborhood. And a couple of you already asked me about who this Maverick guy was, and so we'll talk about that now. We are currently in Maverick Square, and I want to talk a little bit about the person, Samuel Maverick, who gave his name to this square and Maverick Street and the neighborhood immediately around it. So Samuel Maverick is an interesting guy. I think many would call him a deplorable person, but historically somebody worth discussing. For an element of New England's history and Boston's history that is often neglected or ignored, and that is its relationship to slavery. So Samuel Maverick lived here. This was Noddle's Island before even the Massachusetts Bay Company arrived. And he actually entertained John Winthrop when Winthrop came on this mission from Salem looking for better land to settle, which they eventually did in Charlestown before moving over to the Shawmut Peninsula. What made Maverick a little bit different from the people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony is that he was Anglican. He was a loyalist to the crown and did not like Puritans very much. He didn't get along well with the Puritans, and the feeling was mutual. In fact, he would frequently write to the king saying that these people in Boston are exceeding their charter and acting like an independent city-state. In 1666, he was one of 4 commissioners appointed by the king to sort of check out the colonies and write a report on the colonies, and especially who was bossing around who. And that's where he made that conclusion that Boston, sort of all high and mighty in New England, saw itself as this independent city-state. Like I said, the love wasn't returned. He was periodically banned from going over to Boston. But I want to talk about the legacy I talked about at the beginning, which was slavery. So one of the things that Maverick is known for is one of the earliest accounts of somebody in New England holding African slaves. And we have a traveler's account that mentions this in particular, that he had purchased a small number of slaves and that he had tried to have a male slave lie with a female slave, but the female slave resisted. She did not want that, and so he ordered the male slave to rape her. This was relayed as the reason being that he wanted to create a breed of Negroes. That was the term used, and this was in 1638. And, it's really important for us to remember that there wasn't any sort of aversion to slavery among most of the colonists and the people who were here, Puritan and Anglican. In fact, lest we think, oh, well, Samuel Maverick was an Anglican, he wasn't a Puritan, he didn't hold the same sort of morals, right? He acquired his slaves from a tiny island called Providence Island, which is about 100 miles off the coast of Nicaragua, that was settled by Puritans in 1630 at the exact same time as Boston was. Right? In fact, it's really the same group because Puritans left England, right, in waves, in groups. They got charters from the crown to settle in different places. Really was the same group that went to Providence Island and other places in the Caribbean and the West Indies. And, they determined that they wanted slaves to work agriculturally, to create products for them so that they can sell them to Europe, and that's how they saw their colony surviving. New England, and Boston in particular, they were central to this slave economy. They were central to the trade between slaving islands in the West Indies that relied on large numbers of slaves, financing it, and even personal relations, people going back and forth to work there. By the turn of the 17th century, there were about 1,000 African slaves living in New England. So slavery absolutely was here. But the fact that there weren't more, and there were more in the West Indies, had nothing to do with Puritanism, and really had everything to do with the geography and the perceived needs of labor for agricultural work. So New England and Boston were completely connected to the more slave-intensive islands in the Caribbean, as well as the southern United States. Maverick himself had been to Virginia. He knew the colonists in Providence Island. And Boston was central to that in its financing, in its trade. And also, of course, people were not hesitant to own slaves when it suited them. In fact, Boston also sold slaves. So the first slaves that they started selling were as a result of the Pequot War and captives that the colonists took from the native population in the Pequot War. And they put a bunch of these people on a boat to head to Providence Island to sell to the Puritans there. And it was on that boat, on the return voyage, a boat captained by somebody from Salem, that brought back Maverick's African slaves. So this ship was called the Desire, sort of disturbingly enough, and became a slaving ship. And, that's just sort of one more point to make that, not only was Boston a place that was not always abolitionist, and not only were Puritans by no means averse to having slaves, to taking them, or to selling them, but, Boston was involved in the slave trade itself. And we'll hear more about that in Deer Island, namely with the native population that it captured in wars, and selling them and shipping them off to the Caribbean. So we are on Paris Street, just on the edge of what was the dense, Jewishly populated part of the East End. Actually, most synagogues and kosher butchers and stores, etc., were a little farther north along Chelsea Street. But this was the site of the first and the largest and the last synagogue in East Boston. It was called Ohel Jacob. And as you can see on this mural, that very much ties into what I was saying about how the neighborhood sees itself, right? Sees itself as an immigrant neighborhood and as a place that has absorbed immigrants over the years. You can sort of track this. Next to the Lyman School on the right, it says St. John's Episcopal Church. Well, Ohel Jacob bought that church in 1893 and had its services there. I believe it was founded in 1891. They had services somewhere else, but in 1893, they started really having their community organizations and religious activities in the St. John's Episcopal Church. And then in 1905, they had enough money to tear down the church and build their own new building. So if you look, 2 buildings over from the Paris Street Gymnasium, it says Temple Ohel Jacob. That was the permanent and largest synagogue in the neighborhood during a period of dense Jewish residents around here. Now, the synagogue actually burned down in 1973. But what's interesting is that it wasn't rebuilt. They sold the property to the East Boston Community Center. But the point is that by the time it burned down in 1973, there were very few Jews left living in East Boston. Many of the smaller congregations had moved to the suburbs or closed, and Ohel Jacob had actually become a sort of union of three of the surviving congregations in East Boston. So the fire was sort of the final nail and the end of really significant Jewish community presence in East Boston. There's another interesting spot within East Boston related to Jewish history within this city. But the first Jewish cemetery in the city is near Constitution Beach in East Boston, up from here. At that time, this was in 1844. The property was purchased by Oabe Shalom, which was the first significant Jewish religious institution in the city. It wasn't purchased there because it was close to where they were. Jews weren't living nearby there. They were living primarily in the South End, but rather that's where they could purchase the land. That's where it was available. That's where they're allowed to do it. But the city recognized it as a Jewish cemetery and gave them essentially the license to have a Jewish cemetery, which marked the official beginning of the Jewish community in the city, right? It was the first institution, this plot of land near Constitution Beach, that was recognized by the city as, a Jewish domain, and actually has a chapel on the property, as was often the case. Often cemeteries were built far away from where people lived because they were built on the outskirts of the city, right? So with Jewish cemeteries, many of the synagogues who owned the plots where the cemeteries were made built chapels so that they could have services there when somebody passed away, right? It was, a long way to get from the South End out to East Boston. And so they wanted to have the service at the actual place before going to the graveside. And they built beautiful chapels. This one isn't in use anymore. But interestingly enough, there were plans, never came to fruition, but plans in the 90s and 2000s to turn this little chapel into a museum about immigration in East Boston and a museum specifically about the immigration station in East Boston because it was being torn down. This was a plan that was in the news that was being considered, and it was seen as sort of an appropriate thing to use this chapel to build the museum that they weren't able to build about the immigration station, since it was a place used by people who had immigrated to the city. So I want to talk about a couple of things related to this mural and the message of the neighborhood as a community of caring and a place that absorbs immigrants. The mural itself, what do people see there? What's represented? Right, diversity. So, right, there's a lot of fleeing. Milton makes the important point that the way, much of this is presented, right, of how people came here is actually less about opportunity than about fleeing something, right? Scandinavians fleeing crop failures, the Irish fleeing famine, Jews fleeing violence. But it certainly strongly in the memory of the story of absorption is absorbing people who are not just fleeing coming for a better life, but fleeing something else. The last thing I want to say about this mural and immigration is that a significant missing group is African Americans, right? And, there was a significant population of Blacks who moved from the South as part of the Great Migration. And the reason why, they did not move into this particular neighborhood and other neighborhoods like it was resistance to integration. And some of the best qualities that I talked about Eastie residents, fighting for their rights, fighting City Hall, fighting against casinos and expansion of the airport and the highway and all of these things, were also mobilized to fight against integration of the schools and public housing. And that's just part of the story. And in fact, to attempt to integrate this part of the city as they were attempting to integrate other other parts of the city in the 1970s and 1980s, new housing projects were constructed that were meant as mixed projects, right, and integrated housing. And the environment was so hostile to African Americans who moved into these, what were intended as mixed projects, that they were literally driven out. And by the 1980s, these, mixed projects had essentially become all white. And that is part of the story as well. But of course, times change. This is not a majority Italian neighborhood anymore. It's a majority Hispanic neighborhood. It's much more diverse. It's still absorbing people from all over the world. And I think very much still sees itself as, a community of caring where people coexist from different places. All right, so our next stop, because I know you guys are very hungry, I am too, is Santarpios. This is an East Boston institution. You might see it on your way to the airport. It was founded in 1903 by the Santarpio family. They're still running it. It was founded as a bakery. And then in 1933, they decided, hey, let's start selling some pizza and some Italian-American food to cater to increasing Italianification of the neighborhood. And they've been in business ever since. I can smell it from here. So we've made it to Deer Island. Today, this is the site of a major wastewater treatment facility that cleans the city of Boston's sewage before being sent out into the Atlantic Ocean. Just on the other side of this hill, there are massive sludge digesters that clean the wastewater. This is not an island anymore. It's more of a peninsula connected by a stretch of beach over there. But this was one of Boston's harbor islands and one with a very troubled, even infamous past. That's because it has to do with how the native people in the Boston area were treated by the colonists of the Massachusetts Bay Company. It was during King Philip's War that large numbers of praying Indians, native people who had converted to Christianity and were living in praying towns in the surrounding area, were collected together, marched, tied together, and brought to Deer Island and other surrounding harbor islands to be interred, supposedly for their own good, supposedly for their protection from other native peoples who were at war with the colonists and who might attack them. In reality, everybody understood that the real reason was the colonists' inability to tell what they saw as friend from enemy among the native population, and their great fear and indeed hatred of the surrounding natives. So in 1775, and between 1775 and 76, essentially all of the native people in the town surrounding Boston were interred here. They were not allowed to leave. They were meant to fend for themselves through planting and harvesting. And over half of them starved to death or died from exposure. I mean, as you can see from where we're standing, this is the Atlantic, and this island itself is a barrier to the harbor, and so takes much of the brunt of the wind and the bad weather as it comes in from the Atlantic. During King Philip's War, when the so-called praying Indians were interred here, no one was allowed to leave. Those who did escape were returned to the island. There were privateering kidnappers who kidnapped people off of the island to sell them for slavery. And those who avoided interment here, the native people who who did manage to avoid internment here only did so by being put to useful service, as they called it, for the colonists and kept as domestics, or probably more accurately slaves. One of the other things that's significant about this internment was that it marked the end of an attempt by the Massachusetts Bay Company, by Puritans and by colonists, a conscious effort to teach the native people and convert the native people in a sort of hybrid environment between their own tribal life and the European life through the creation not only of these praying towns, but the Indian College at Harvard University and the printing press that was set up specifically to print the Bible in the Algonquin language. After the native people were interred here, after it became clear that they were not perceived to be equal Christians, let alone humans, and after the war itself created significant animosity against native people by the English who were living here, the praying towns either disappeared or went into decline. My disclaimer here would be that those who went to Harvard's Indian College, those who joined life in the prayer towns, had always done so strategically and because it fit their particular purposes and needs in terms of protection in a changing environment. But even this sort of feigned attempt at alliance or at hybridity was abandoned following King Philip's War. Now, as I talked about at the beginning, this is now the site of a major wastewater treatment facility, which has done a lot of good for the city of Boston. In the 1980s, the city of Boston was dumping raw, untreated sewage into Boston Harbor. It was known as the dirtiest harbor in America, and it was due to a number of federal lawsuits against the city that forced its hand to build facilities to properly treat its sewage and clean up the water, leading to what today is I think, a relatively clean harbor. But native groups asked, rightfully, why here? Why does it need to be constructed here? Instead of some kind of acknowledgement of what took place here, or some kind of alternative. Native groups did make a significant effort to resist the plan and protested, but ultimately to no avail, and the plant was constructed. So this is one of those interesting moments where we all want something, but it clashes also with what the needs are of an important community that's still here for historical recognition. And not just the historical recognition that they died here by the hundreds, that they were enslaved from here, that they were kept here as a prison, but also the fact that these harbor islands were theirs, that these were the grounds where they hunted, they fished. So sometimes two goods can be in conflict with one another, and there are continued efforts by native groups to have that history acknowledged in a meaningful way. So Deer Island had another chapter in its history in the 19th century. That was during the Irish potato famine, the worst years of which were 1845 to 1849. And when this spot became a place not just to absorb people coming from Ireland, but also to contain them. In 1847, the worst year of the potato famine, a hospital was built on these grounds where the wastewater treatment facility is now. Part of the reason it was built certainly was to help the people arriving, many of whom were sick, but it was also a way to keep people here. They were quarantined in horrible conditions, and between 1845 and 1850, 800 people who were quarantined on the island died of poor health and various diseases. In 1850, a decision was made to change the hospital to build a bigger building as an almshouse, with the idea that this would help the poor, help them get better before being allowed to come to the city of Boston proper, or being deported if they couldn't support themselves. And this almshouse was a large building that operated between 1853 and 1896. And I guess it's no surprise that in 1896 this became a prison. I suppose the objective was different between the hospital and the almshouse and the prison, but in all cases, the goal was to keep people here before making decisions about what to do with them. The prison operated between 1896 and 1991 when the decision was made to tear down the building and turn it into the wastewater treatment facility. The experience of the Irish coming to Boston, and specifically the hospital and then the almshouse on Deer Island, has been commemorated through a recent Celtic cross that was placed on the top of that hill. The person most associated with the environmental stewardship of the island and of Boston, Judge David Mazzone, who presided over, I should say, the federal court lawsuit that forced the city to clean up its harbor, has quite a large memorial just down this walkway to signify this individual effort in reclaiming and cleaning the harbor. The native people have a small plaque. And what's interesting about this small plaque is that it is specifically about 1675 to 1676, and the Christian natives who were starved to death or died from exposure and were kept here during King Philip's War. But what it doesn't say, what is left out, is the bigger issue of the fact that these were places that native people inhabited. These were places that were their homelands. And in recent years, native people are making more efforts to create living memorials here. One event is a paddle along the Charles River from Natick down right up to Deer Island. And there are other memorializations, living memorializations that take place by native groups here. And so the challenge for the city of Boston going forward is really going to be to find a way to both acknowledge what was done to native people, not just on Deer Island, but in the area, to acknowledge Boston's connection to slavery and the slave trade, but at the same time, to understand that to clean up the harbor, to clean up the Charles River, which still has a long way to go, is in everybody's interest. And at the same time, that native people are still here, and native people deserve to be acknowledged, their history is acknowledged, and their voice in the present acknowledged. And that's the real challenge and contradiction of both East Boston and Deer Island.